Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Spirits of Sights. Tonight, we bring you 5 deeply disturbing true Pacific Northwest horror stories. These accounts will make you question what lurks in the misty forests and along the isolated coastlines of this strange, beautiful region. These are not fiction. They are rooted in eyewitness testimony, archival research, and investigative reporting from people who experienced the inexplicable, where the border between civilization and wilderness runs thin. Each tale in this episode is compiled from first-hand accounts, historical records, and painstaking research that reveal the darker side of the evergreen world. The Pacific Northwest has always kept secrets, and some of those secrets defy reason. Perhaps some truths are meant to stay buried in the depths of the woods and the cold, fog-choked sea. If you enjoy horror grounded in reality stories that linger long after the video ends, subscribe to Spirits of Sights now, and ring the bell so you don't miss our deep dives into the unexplained. After you watch, tell us your own Pacific Northwest encounters in the comments. We read everyone. Now, settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare as we uncover the darkness that lives in the shadows of the pines and along the fog-shrouded shore. Eleanor Hayes moved to the remote logging village of Pinefall in the spring of 1991. She had been drawn there by the same reasons that pulled many people out of the booming lowland cities: the promise of an affordable house, a slower rhythm of life, and a smallness that felt like relief after decades of noisy, crowded classrooms. She was 62, newly retired from a long career teaching elementary school, and she wanted nothing more than a quiet place to finish her days where neighbors still remembered one another's names. Pinefall seemed to answer that wish. The town had fewer than 200 year-round residents. Most were connected, directly or indirectly, to the timber industry that had shaped the valley for nearly a century. The houses were simple, well cared for. A single row of businesses, a general store, and a small cafe marked the town's modest center. Forest rose hard and close on every side, a ring of green that gave Pinefall both its livelihood and its isolation. At first, the people were politely welcoming. They helped Eleanor carry boxes into the narrow 2-bedroom house she bought at the far end of Alder Lane. The woman at the store, Clara Benson, who had lived there all her life, learned her preferred tea and always set aside the same brand. The regulars at the cafe nodded or offered a civil comment when Eleanor came in for an occasional lunch. Still, beneath the surface courtesy, Eleanor noticed a reserve. Conversations stalled when she stepped into rooms. Neighbors exchanged looks she could not read. There was a sense, faint but persistent, that something was being protected, that Pinefall kept certain things carefully to itself. She wrote the wariness off, at first, to the guardedness. Small towns often extended to newcomers. She told herself patience would do what politeness would not. She volunteered at the tiny library, helped organize a spring cleanup at the one recreational lot, and made quiet efforts to meet people on their own terms. The responses stayed the same, a careful friendliness that never became intimacy. They were amiable but cautious, eager to be polite without letting her cross whatever invisible line marked the true circle of inclusion. Late September brought talk of the Harvest event. Eleanor first heard of it while picking up soup stock at Clara's store. Clara stood behind the counter, speaking in low tones with 2 or 3 other long-time residents about food, schedules, and duties. Eleanor asked casually where she might watch, or whether volunteers were needed. Talk dropped like a curtain. Clara's pleasant face tightened. She exchanged a look with the others. Then, as if choosing the softest words, she explained that the harvest gathering was not for recent arrivals. It was a private observance reserved for families rooted in Pinefall through generations. New families, or newcomers like Eleanor, she said apologetically, were expected to wait 7 full seasons before being asked to join. It was tradition, she insisted, nothing personal. Eleanor accepted the answer outwardly, though she felt the sting. 7 seasons sounded arbitrary and stubborn, an eccentricity she would have expected in a place that prized its lineage. She thanked Clara and left, telling herself it was an odd custom and that, in time, it might change. But as October deepened, the town's demeanor shifted in ways she could no longer rationalize away. The chatter about the harvest grew hushed and eager. Children were kept close after school. The loggers came home earlier. Tools and trucks disappeared from the main road by mid-afternoon. A pressure, like a held breath, tightened across Pinefall. The date set for the harvest was deliberately chosen. The night of the new moon in late October, the darkest night of the month. On that day, the town shut down. The store closed its doors long before dusk. The cafe served its last meal at noon and drew down the blinds. Eleanor watched neighbors leave their houses in small family clusters, wrapped in calmed purpose. Most wore plain, dark clothing and carried wrapped bundles. No one looked at her. No one offered explanations. By nightfall, she was alone in her house, and the village streets were empty. The secrecy gnawed at her. She had not minded being politely kept out of neighborhood rituals, at least at first. But the way the town disappeared into the woods and the hush that clung to the air fed a curiosity that would not be stilled. She told herself she wanted to understand the place she had chosen, that a glimpse from a distance would satisfy a newcomer's bewilderment. So she dressed in dark clothing, took a small flashlight and left it switched off, and followed the trail that led from the edge of town into the tall firs. The night was dense and ink black. Cloud cover swallowed stars. The trees made a ceiling above her. Eleanor moved slowly, picking her way around roots and rocks she could not clearly see. After perhaps 20 minutes, she noticed a distant glow. It was not the pale light of the moon. It was firelight. Voices rose, chanting together in rhythms that were not English. The sound had a pattern, a cadence that matched the crackle of the flames. She left the trail, slipping through undergrowth as quietly as possible. Approaching on a diagonal, she hoped to remain unseen. What she found in the clearing shook her more deeply than anything she had imagined. The entire town had gathered beneath a ring of towering trees, cedars and pines that must have been centuries old. In the center of that natural amphitheater, a bonfire roared, flames reaching high enough to stain the branches with light. People stood in several concentric circles, all facing inward, their voices rising and falling in that same guttural chant. Closest to the fire were 5 towering figures. At first they looked like large scarecrows, armatures of branches and brush set upright and bound with rope. Each suggested a human shape, nearly 8 feet tall, with a head and outstretched arms. As she watched, members of the crowd stepped forward carrying white-wrapped bundles. They unwrapped them with care, revealing to Eleanor's horror bones, skulls, rib bones, femurs, long yellowed pieces shaped unmistakably like human remains. The town distributed these bones into the frames, weaving them through the branches until the structures were not just likenesses, but constructions containing actual skeletal material. Clara Benson moved to the front and spoke. When she did, she spoke plainly, in clear local English. She addressed the assembly as if she were standing at the store counter, explaining things with the same kindly cadence she had used on afternoons when Eleanor bought tea. She spoke of protection and prosperity. She told a history in halting, practiced phrases, of a bargain struck decades ago when loggers first came into the valley and began to fell the ancient trees. The forest, she said, had its own powers, ancient and jealous. Long ago, the town's forebears had made an offering to those powers. In return, disaster had not come, and the timber had yielded in abundance. The founders had given themselves, she claimed, a willing sacrifice that bound the forest and the people together. The people in the clearing repeated the words of the bargain with fervor. The chanting shifted into a fiercer tempo. The crowd's bodies rocked and jerked. Motion moved from a sway into something frenzied. Men and women lifted the heavy, bone-filled effigies and carried them forward. One by one, they tipped the frames into the fire. When the first figure struck the flames, there was a shower of sparks and a sound that might have been wood cracking, or something more. Heat rolled outward. A smell rose that turned Eleanor's stomach. The sharp, resinous scent of burning pine mixed with a sickening, organic odor. The stench of ancient bone and dried, long-dead flesh. Fear sent her moving backward. She had to get away. She had not planned to be discovered, and she knew in that moment that being seen would be dangerous. She slipped through the undergrowth, placing each step carefully. Then her foot landed on a brittle twig. It broke with a sharp, loud crack. The chanting halted. Silence dropped like a weight. Eleanor froze, breath caught in her throat, as a dozen heads turned toward the dark at the clearing's edge. Someone called out, "Clara again," but the gentle storekeeper's tone had gone entirely. Her voice now ordered a search. People answered, and the woods erupted as men and women moved through the trees, cutting paths with their knowledge of the land. Eleanor abandoned stealth. She ran. The forest closed in. Roots snagged at her shoes. Low branches struck her face. She ran harder than she had in decades, lungs burning, feet pounding along the dim path. Behind her, voices called and converged. They knew every contour of those woods. They moved like shadowed hounds. She does not remember how she found the trail again, whether she stumbled onto it by blind luck or some flicker of memory guided her. She only knew she reached the tree line and broke out onto the empty main road, and she did not stop until she slammed the door of her little house and locked it behind her. She drew curtains tight and waited in a dark fit of trembling, convinced they would beat on her door at any moment. They did not come. At dawn, the town returned to itself. Neighbors came back from the woods in small groups. They talked in quiet tones and then dispersed into their homes. By mid-morning, the store and the cafe were open, and life resumed with the ordinary gestures of people pretending the night had been no different than any other. It was as if a private seam in the town's life had been stitched up again, invisible to anyone who had not been there in the clearing. That same day, unable to stomach being surrounded by a crowd of people she suddenly understood to be something other than what she had thought, Eleanor packed what she could and left. She drove away from Pinefall without looking back, abandoning the house she had bought in the small plan of a quiet retirement. She did not call the police. She did not try to gather proof. What could she have shown? A memory, the smell of smoke in the night, the image of human bones threaded into a burning frame? She had no film, no photographs, nothing that would have withstood skepticism. Who would accept the idea that ordinary neighbors, smiling faces in photographs, had performed what she had witnessed? Years passed. Sometimes she would notice stories in regional papers about the timber company that still operated in Pinefall, about a town that continued to harvest wood while many other logging communities dwindled away. She would see faces in photographs. Clara, men whose faces she recognized from the cafe, and they looked entirely ordinary, household images of weekends and community events. In those pictures, they seemed like any other small-town people, the kind who could be trusted to buy you tea or watch your cat when you were away. But Eleanor's private knowledge remained with her, what she had seen in the clearing, the bargain that had been described in casual, comforting tones, the effigies built around human remains. She held the memory like a cold thing in her chest, a knowledge that underlay her quiet life and made certain mornings sharper and nightier than they otherwise would have been. Frank Mercer had worked the graveyard shift at Harborford's largest sawmill for 14 years when the winter of 1988 brought a string of savage murders that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was 59, the night supervisor in charge of the small crew that kept the mill running through the long hours between midnight and 8 in the morning. Harborford was a town built on timber. Everything in town, from the hardware store to the diner, tied back to the trees that were felled on the surrounding slopes and turned into boards at facilities like the mill where Frank spent his nights. The plant operated 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The scream of blades and the thunder of heavy presses never stopped, except for Sunday, when even the most loyal men rested. The first body was found on the morning of January 12. Roy Coble, a night operator who ran the debarker, had not reported for a shift the night before. His foreman assumed Roy was sick and reassigned the station. When Roy's wife phoned the mill the next morning to say her husband had not returned home, supervisors organized a search. His truck sat in the employee lot, exactly where he had parked the previous evening. Roy himself was discovered in the lumberyard, his body arranged among stacks of freshly cut 2x4s. Frank was summoned to the scene along with Harborford police. What he saw that morning replayed in his head for years. Roy had been killed with a cruelty that suggested deliberation. His body showed marks made by the very equipment the men used every day, circular saw gouges on his torso and limbs, and a heavy hook driven through his chest. Tools of the trade had been turned into instruments of grotesque violence. Officers cordoned off the yard and began interviewing employees. But the night crew reported seeing nothing unusual. Roy had vanished somewhere between the main building and the parking lot, and no one noticed his absence until it was too late. A week later, the second murder occurred. Martin Dane, who ran the planing line at night, was found in a storage shed where finished lumber awaited shipment. The same brutal pattern repeated. Saw blades, chisels, heavy steel hooks, tools familiar to every mill hand had been used with a knowledge that suggested the killer knew how those instruments worked. The city detectives from the State Division arrived to assist the small-town force. They found the two victims shared striking similarities. Both were night shift employees, both had been at the mill for years, and both had been killed using equipment from the very facility where they worked. Frank attended both funerals. He knew Roy and Martin. He had supervised them, drank coffee with them, joked with them during long nights. The senseless violence unsettled him as much as the brutality. Harborford was not a place people expected such horrors. Crime was rare. Doors were often left unlocked, and kids played unsupervised in the yards. The idea that someone was picking off mill workers on the site of their employment wrapped the town in a fog of fear. The killings continued. On February 2, Thomas Corll, a forklift operator on nights, was discovered in the boiler room. On February 9, Edward Cheng, who worked shipping, was found in a maintenance bay. On February 16, James Whitfield, a general laborer, was pulled from near the log pond where raw timber was staged before processing. Each death followed the same pattern. Night shift workers, killed with mill equipment, placed in corners of the facility where they would be discovered after the fact. Whoever had done this seemed to want the bodies found, as if making a statement. Management considered halting night operations, but, faced with the mill's economic importance to Harborford, instead bolstered security. Guards were posted at entrances. Men were asked to move in pairs. Police maintained a round-the-clock presence. Frank found himself watching his crew with a new, uneasy attention. Could the killer be one of the men he shared cigarettes with between shifts? Someone who laughed in the break room and then returned to work with a normal face, while harboring a capacity for unimaginable harm? The suspicion scraped at him every shift. It was Frank who finally pieced together the link the detectives had missed. While reviewing personnel files in the mill office, comparing names and hire dates, he noticed a chilling coincidence. Each of the 5 murdered men had been employed at the mill on June 17, 1981. All 5 had been on the day crew that day, the day of an accident. Frank had tried for years to push to the back of his mind. He pulled the old incident report and reread the details. The accident had happened at a harvest site roughly 20 miles east of Harborford. A massive Douglas fir had been improperly felled. The cut had misjudged the tree's weight distribution. When the tree fell, it struck Samuel Moran, a young logger standing where he should have been safe. Samuel died instantly. His body had been so mangled that the casket at the funeral was closed. The county investigation labeled the death an accident, human error combined with the hazards of logging, and no criminal charges followed. The 6 men on the felling crew that day received additional safety training and returned to work after a brief suspension. Frank stared at the names on the felling crew list: Roy Koval, Martin Dane, Thomas Correll, Edward Chang, James Whitfield, and one more, Daniel Parks. Frank's hands trembled as he picked up the phone and called the lead detective assigned to the murders. He explained the pattern: the victim's shared presence at the Harvest site 7 years earlier. The detective asked the obvious question: where was Daniel Parks now? Frank checked the current night roster. Daniel Parks was on duty that very night in the main cutting room. The detective told Frank to stay put. Frank could not stay. If Daniel Parks was where the police thought he was, then other men who did not suspect anything might be standing between a killer and his next victim. Frank walked through the humming plant toward the cutting room, the floor thudding with the rhythm of machines. He found Daniel alone by the largest circular saw, a disc capable of slicing logs 3 feet in diameter. Daniel stood staring at the blade, tears on his face, jaw set like a man who had made a terrible decision. In his hand he clutched a lumber hook, the kind that had been used on Roy Koval. Frank called his name above the machine noise and stepped closer. Daniel told Frank to remember Samuel Moran. Frank said he remembered. Samuel had been 23, married with a baby on the way. Daniel said Samuel had been his cousin and the closest friend he'd ever had. It had been Daniel who found Samuel's crushed body beneath that fallen tree. It had been Daniel who told Samuel's wife there would be no return. Daniel said the accident had not been an accident in his eyes. The felling crew had cut corners, he said. They had ignored safety because supervisors pushed them to meet quotas. They had known the tree was dangerous. They had known Samuel stood too near. Yet they had made the cut anyway. For 7 years, Daniel had watched those men keep working, keep laughing, keep living as if nothing had happened. He had decided to give them the justice the courts had not. Frank tried to reason with him. He argued that violence would not bring Samuel back, that revenge would destroy Daniel as surely as any punishment. But Daniel had already given himself away. He said he had been planning for years and that only one name remained on his list, one man who still needed to pay for what had happened that hot June day. Daniel lifted the hook and stepped toward Frank. Then Frank remembered a critical detail and spoke it calmly, even as his pulse thudded. He told Daniel to check the records again. Frank had not been at the Harvest site that day in 1981. He had worked at the mill. He could point to time cards, to machine logs. He had not been one of the felling crew. Daniel's certainty wavered. The hesitation was brief, but it was enough. Outside, blue lights flashed and boots thundered on metal. Detectives and uniformed officers poured into the cutting room, weapons drawn, and ordered Daniel to drop the hook. He did. He let them handcuff him without struggle. As they led him away, he turned toward Frank, eyes hollow, and apologized for having nearly taken another life in his single-mindedness, for acting on a memory and not confirming a fact. He said he had been so focused on finishing what he had started that he had not verified the last name. Frank watched Daniel taken into custody and felt only a profound sadness. The accident 7 years earlier had ruined more than one life. It had given birth to further ruin. The final member of the felling crew, the name Frank never learned, fled Harborford the night Daniel was arrested. He disappeared into the broader world where men go when they run from consequences. The mill tightened safety protocols. Management held mandatory retraining sessions and emphasized workplace responsibility. But Frank knew that no amount of paperwork would remove the pressures that made corners tempting in a profit-driven industry. He worked 1 more year at the facility and then retired, unable to continue in a place where the memory He left Harborford with a keen understanding of how a single careless mistake, compounded by economic pressure and silence, can reverberate through lives for years, and how the desire for retribution can make monsters of ordinary men. Have you ever wondered why some people vanish in plain sight during natural disasters? I hadn't given it much thought until the spring of 2024, when I took a position as a research historian with the Columbia Basin Historical Archive. My specialty was early 20th century logging history, and I was assigned to digitize and catalog a stack of documents connected to the Tarnuk burn, the catastrophic series of fires that consumed roughly 350,000 acres of prime timberland between 1933 and 1951. Most folks who know regional history learned the basics in school. The first blaze began on August 14, 1933, likely sparked by logging operations. Drought and fierce winds turned it into an inferno that burned for nearly 3 weeks. What followed were decades of replanting and 3 more major fires across the same ridge. It was the kind of story you found in textbooks and museum displays. Ecological catastrophe, slow recovery, lessons learned. What I discovered at the bottom of Box 47 in the archive changed everything I thought I knew. The box had been misfiled. The catalog listed it as routine firewatch reports and supply requisitions from 1932-1934. Most of the contents matched that label: tedious logs of weather and inventories of drip torches and canvas. But beneath those pages, tucked in a taped manila envelope and sealed with a blob of red wax, I found a letter that had never been opened. The envelope was addressed to the director of the State Forestry Commission. Someone had written, "Confidential, not for circulation," on the front in faded red ink. A later hand had added, "Archive upon recipient death, 2009. Cross-referencing personnel records told me the intended recipient had indeed been the forestry director who died in 2009 at age 23. The envelope had been placed in the archives as instructed, left untouched for 15 years until my gloved fingers broke the seal. The letter was dated September 3, 1933. It was written on letterhead from Lookout 9, a firewatch station perched on a ridge that overlooked what later became the heart of the burn zone. The handwriting was unsteady and urgent, nothing like the calm, neat script of official reports. It began, "Director Hale, I write this confession because the weight of what I have done is killing me, and because you deserve the truth about the men we lost." The official record, the writer said, would list 48 loggers and firefighters dead in the Tarnuk burn. "The truth," he wrote, "is that I chose who would live and who would die. I would make the same choice again." God forgive me. The letter was signed by a man named Thomas Reed, the firewatch operator on duty in Lookout 9, that August. I spent the next week trying to verify Reed's claims. His personnel file confirmed his assignment to Lookout 9 in 1933 and showed a resignation effective September 15 of that year, citing health concerns and personal crisis. There was a note that Reed had declined counseling for what was recorded as nervous exhaustion from firewatch duty. He moved to California soon after and died in 1967. That was all public record. What kept me awake were the particulars he described in the letter. According to Reed's account, on August 16, the third day of the conflagration, the smoke began to behave in ways that did not match the wind. He wrote of shapes forming in the column of flame and ash, of the smoke coalescing into something that looked disturbingly human, impossibly tall, and moving against the gusts. At first, he assumed heat and fatigue were tricking him. Then the shape turned toward his lookout. Reed said he felt, rather than heard, a communication, not words, but a presence that filled his head with a clear understanding. The entity, Reed called it the Burn Man, climbed the ridge as if the flames were a road, and when it reached Lookout 9, it offered him a bargain. It would bend the fire away from 2 logging camps, saving roughly 130 men. The third camp, however, would be wholly consumed. Reed had 20 minutes to decide before the wind would make the choice irrelevant. He described his decision in agonizing detail. Camp A housed 73 men, mostly family men from the nearby town of Tarnuk. Camp B sheltered 49 younger hands and many transient workers. Camp C counted 48 men, a mixed crew. Reed chose to save Camps A and B, condemning Camp C. He wrote the selection down on a scrap of paper. The burn man nodded and then sank back into the flames. Within an hour, the wind shifted in a way meteorologists later called inexplicable. The fire veered away from Camps A and B and drove straight into Camp C. All 48 men perished. Official investigators explained it as a tragic confluence of topography and sudden wind change. Reed's letter did not end there. He described how, in the weeks and years after the fire, he would see the burn man and smoke from smaller blazes, watching him from the fog of embers. The trade, he wrote, was not a one-off. The burn man had marked him. Through him, it had marked Lookout 9 and the surrounding ridge. Reed begged Director Hale to demolish the tower, to declare the ridge off-limits, to do anything to prevent another watchman from being forced into the same choice. The letter read like the confession of a man unraveling under guilt, but there were details I could corroborate. I checked records for the later fires, 1939, 1945, 1951. In each event, curious wind shifts were logged that saved some valleys while devastating others. In survivors' statements, I found reports of shapes seen in smoke, of voices in the ash, of an unnerving sense of being observed. Lookout 9 was used again in 1939, but the operator's file recorded a complete nervous breakdown and a refusal to discuss his experience. The tower was dismantled in 1952, though the ridge remained reachable by trails. Patterns emerged that resisted easy explanation. The death tolls and the behavior of the fires felt, to my historian's eye, almost deliberate. I could not let it go. In late June, I drove to the Tarnuk State Forest on a long weekend and hiked to the coordinates where Lookout 9 once stood. Replanting had done its work. Younger Douglas fir and hemlock had filled the valley. The concrete footings for the tower remained, and around them the ground was bare. Nothing grew in that small circle, despite decades of regrowth, as though the earth itself refused to heal. I brought a photocopy of Reed's confession, thinking reading it at the site might help me settle the matter in my head. Maybe it would make everything into a story of trauma rather than something literal. As I stood on the ridge, the forest went silent. It happened all at once. Birds stopped mid-song. Insects ceased. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the smell came, not the mild tang of a distant campfire, but the acrid, animal reek of burning flesh and singed hair mixed with resin. Heat surged across my skin. When I looked down, I saw smoke rising where there was no flame, a column that twisted and swerved against the prevailing breeze. It moved with intent, threading between trunks, and as it traveled it took form, limbs, a torso, a head, a shape of ash and vapor at least 20 feet tall. The burn man. It was not metaphor. It was not an hallucination. It regarded me. The same nonverbal understanding Reed had claimed flooded my mind. The thing showed me the next fire, the one it said would come in the summer of 2027 in a record drought. The victims in the vision were not logging crews this time, but hikers. A youth wilderness program. People spread thin across trails. The burn man offered me the same choice. Select who would be spared and who would be sacrificed, or let the wind decide for itself. I ran. I'm not proud of that flight. I tumbled down the trail in blind panic until I reached my car, and I drove straight back to the city. The next day, I resigned from the archive, citing personal reasons. But before I left, I made copies of Reed's letter and sent them to anyone I thought might listen. Regional foresters, federal fire management officials, a few academics, and fire ecology. Most responses were polite and skeptical. One ranger wrote back that Tarnuk did exhibit unusual fire behavior and that certain ridgelines burned hotter and with more erratic winds than models predicted, attributing the oddities to soil and slope. That explanation felt thin. Now it was July 2025, and the Pacific Northwest was baking under extraordinary heat and drought. Fire danger was extreme across Oregon and Washington. 3 days earlier, an anonymous envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a Firewatch assignment for the Tarnuk district. My name was on it. I had not applied. I was not qualified. The posting listed a 3-month rotation beginning in August and placed the station at Ridge 9, the exact spot where Lookout 9 had stood, where the burn man, Reed had insisted, waited in the scorched earth. Part of me wanted to toss the notice and carry on, but Reed's words had a way of nestling into thought. He had written that the burn man marked you by being seen, that the mark passed from one watchman to the next if someone filled the post. I feared that ignoring the assignment would allow the fire to choose indiscriminately. If Reed was right, and I could not convince myself he wasn't, then showing up might save lives. It might mean I would be the hand that decided who lived and who did not. It might mean I would become what Reed had become, a survivor who bore the weight of choosing. So I began to prepare. I mapped trails, listed summer programs and group permits, identified likely camping areas. I traced how hikers moved through the ridges. Every night now, even in my Portland apartment, I smell smoke, phantom smoke that wakes me and lingers until I place my palm on the windowsill and force myself to breathe. I think about the moment I stood on that ridge and felt a presence fill my head. I think about Reed's final line, "I would make the same choice again." The assignment starts in 3 weeks. I am learning the names of people who will be in the forest this summer. I am learning the routes they take, and I know, with a clarity that makes my stomach twist, that the trade Reed described is waiting to be fulfilled. All that remains is for someone to answer the bell. All that remains is for me to decide whether to become the hand that saves some by damning others, or to refuse and let the fire choose. What if the parcel of land you bought came with something that was never mentioned in the deed? I learned that lesson the hard way, and it cost me far more than money. My name was Ethan Caldwell, and until 6 months earlier, I ran a small but profitable real estate development firm in Portland. I specialized in coastal lots, undervalued parcels with views, places a tech executive from California would pay a fortune to escape to for a weekend. The work was clean, straightforward, and it paid well. Then I found a listing south of Needlepoint, and everything I thought I knew about ownership, about the ground beneath our feet, turned out to be wrong. The 4-acre parcel showed up on an estate sale in March. It hugged the shoreline, protected from the worst of the weather by a natural rock outcrop, with an uninterrupted view of the Pacific that most buyers only dreamed of. The land had been in a single family since the 1920s, but the last heir had died childless. The estate wanted a quick sale. The asking price was absurdly low, roughly a third of comparable coastal lots, and there were no buildings, nothing to slow development. I called the agent and made an offer, 20% above asking, cash, no inspection contingencies. I wanted to close before anyone else smelled the bargain. She sounded relieved. We closed in 2 weeks. I should have asked why she was in such a hurry. I should have asked why that perfect strip of land had remained undeveloped for a century. We broke ground in mid-April. I hired a local crew with decades of experience on the coast. The plan was elegant. A single, 5-bedroom home with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. Quality finishes. the kind of place an affluent buyer would fight over. Permits slid through with unusual ease, which should have been the first red flag. By noon on the first day, the excavator struck something about 3 feet down. My foreman, Dale, a man who had built more coastal houses than I total projects, asked me to come see. What we uncovered were stones, 47 of them set in a perfect circle about 30 feet across. Not random rocks, but roughly cut blocks, each the size of a shoebox, etched with symbols none of us recognized. They had been deliberately placed. They formed a ring right where I planned to lay the foundation. Dale went still. He told me quietly the crews sometimes found artifacts or ceremonial stones, and that the right move was to stop and contact the local tribal authority. I know how that sounds. I know I should have followed protocol, but I had $200,000 sunk into permits and materials. Delays meant cost. So I had the stones removed, boxed, and locked in my equipment shed. We poured the foundation that weekend. Dale quit the following Monday. 3 others left with him. I replaced them and kept building. The problems began, small, then escalated. In May, the new excavator's hydraulics failed for no reason. A generator, recently serviced, caught fire. Nail guns misfired. Saws jammed on straight cuts. We went through more replacement tools in a month than I usually used in a year. Then the injuries started. A foreman cut that should have healed turned septic. A carpenter suffered a splinter that became infected and cost him 2 fingers. In June, a framing carpenter fell from the 2nd story. His harness, properly anchored, unclipped itself. He survived, badly broken. OSHA investigated, found no negligence, called it a freak accident. But after a run like that, no one in my industry used the word freak lightly. A few weeks later, a woman representing the Confederated Chillam tribes came to the site. Her name was Asha, and she spoke plainly. She said the land was a threshold site, a place where the material world and the spirit world overlapped, and that the circle of stones I had disturbed were boundary markers. They had been placed, she told me, to keep whatever lay beneath the tide from crossing over. She offered to buy the property back from me, double what I'd paid, no questions asked, and to restore the site. I should have taken the offer. I did not. I was practical. I was a businessman. I told myself I did not believe in spirits, and that legal counsel would handle any claims of cultural value. I told Asha my lawyers would be in touch if she continued to interfere. That night, I had the first dream. In the dream, I stood on my property and watched the ocean. The water was wrong, not blue or gray, but absolute black, viscous and moving with a kind of wrong geometry. Shapes slid up from the surf. They were not fish. They were wrong to look at. Limbs bent the wrong way, bodies stretched into dimensions that made my eyes ache. In the dream, I understood, with a clarity that was not mine, that those things had always been there beyond perception, just past the edge where our world thinned. The stones had been a lock. I had opened it. I woke with a nosebleed, sheets soaked in sweat, a metallic, briny smell in my sinuses. I kept building. July brought tides that no one could explain. Water pushed onto my lot 200 feet beyond the established high tide line. It happened during neap tides, when the ocean should have been low. My new foundation showed hairline cracks. Salt seeped into concrete rated for marine environments. Things began washing up on the beach directly in front of the property. Deep water fish crushed by pressure, squid not meant for sunlight, and once, horrifyingly, a pale shape with too many joints in its limbs. State marine biologists took samples and left perplexed. The die-offs and the concentration of strange specimens at that one stretch of shore made no scientific sense. The replacement crew walked away in early August. They said they heard voices at night calling their names from the breakers. One man swore he'd seen handprints press up through wet concrete, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out from beneath. Another said lengths of lumber had rearranged themselves overnight. Framing boards shifted into patterns matching the symbols on the stones. I accused them of shirking. I threatened lawsuits. They left anyway. Asha returned in mid-August with 2 elders. This time, she did not offer money. She warned. The tide, she said, was reaching in farther every day. The stones, boundary markers kept for generations, had been disturbed. At the autumn equinox, something would try to cross that breach, and whatever came through could not be sent back. She told me stories. An attempt in the 1950s, a developer found on the sand with every bone pulverized, though no wound marred his skin. I laughed at them then. I said I would see them in court if they trespassed. I laughed to keep from listening. That night, the ocean came for me. I was sleeping in my pickup on the lot to keep an eye on things. I couldn't afford a hotel and couldn't afford further vandalism. At 3 in the morning, the ground under my truck began to bubble. Black water rose from below, though the tide was out and the water table sat scores of feet down. It pooled around the tires with a smell like old kelp and something animal. In that liquid, things first pulled themselves onto the shore. They moved wrong. They existed in planes my eyes could not comfortably follow. As they climbed the sand, they looked at me. They knew. They knew I had disturbed the ring. They were thankful. I ran. I left the truck, the tools, the half-built house. I ran until I found Highway 101 and flagged down a car. I spent 3 days in the hospital for exposure and shock. When I was discharged, I called Asha. I offered her the deed. Not as a sale, but as a gift. Sign whatever papers you need, I told her. Take it and do what you must. She came to the hospital with the documents ready. Within a week, the land had been transferred to the tribal authorities. They had people standing by, as it turned out, ritual specialists, traditional stewards, waiting the moment they got the title to perform restoration and resealing ceremonies. They had expected this possibility. They had plans that I had not seen. 2 months later, I returned once to see what had been done. The half-built house was gone, every trace lifted as clean as if a storm had never hit. The stones were back in a ring, and new blocks had been added. The concrete footings I had poured were removed. The tiny circle of earth at the former tower remained bare, but the tide at high water stopped cleanly where it should. The shoreline looked whole. Asha walked up to the property line and met me there. She did not glare. She looked tired. "We sealed it," she said, "for now. But it's weaker than it once was. Every time someone breaks the markers and leaves, the work to repair it grows harder. There aren't many who remember how. I sold the development company soon after. I could not keep treating landscape as mere investment, not after what I'd done. I took work on crews, basic labor, honest hours. When colleagues start chasing coastal deals that sound too good to be true, I tell them the story. Most don't listen. They laugh or call me superstitious. A few step away. Some nights I sleep easier knowing that at least one threshold site has been sealed again. Some nights, though, I dream of black water and limbs that make your brain fold over, and I smell the salt and iron tang of rot in my sheets. The elders told me a truth. I could not have learned any other way. Ownership is an illusion. We occupy land for a spell. We do not own the deep places that do the real work of holding things apart. Some sites exist to keep the abysmal edges of the world contained. When profit blinds you, when you treat those places like inventory, you loosen the knots that bind the dark back where it belongs. And when those knots fray, the cost is counted in something far stranger than dollars, the integrity of the world we depend on. How would you react if you learned your town's entire history was a carefully constructed lie. I'm a fifth-generation resident of Port Fathom, born and raised in what we all call the oldest settlement west of the mountains. I truly believed I knew everything about this place. My ancestors arrived in the 1880s running the same general supply on Harbor Avenue for more than 100 years. I was raised on the legends, the tales of the rugged old times, the fishing booms, and the notorious crimping tunnels under the city where men were supposedly drugged and forced onto ships heading out to sea. It's a dark past, no doubt, but it's the kind of gritty, romanticized darkness that visitors adore. The kind of thing that fuels the haunted walking tours and fills the local gift shops with books. But what I found 3 months ago, buried beneath my own family's building, it proved that the tunnels were just a story, a convenient cover for something so much worse. It all began with a basic repair job. The building housing our supply shop was erected in 1901, and its foundation was finally giving in. Cracks, water damage, just decades of seaside storms doing their work. I brought in a structural engineer to survey the problem. He's the one who found it. He discovered the basement was actually larger than any of the blueprints showed. There was an entire section walled off, sealed with brick sometime in the early 1900s. And behind that brick barrier, his ground-penetrating radar showed a void. An empty space. My initial thought was that we'd stumbled onto one of the famous crimping tunnels. I thought it would be fantastic for business. We could set up tours, sell tickets, make it a whole new attraction. So, I got the city permits to excavate. I hired a crew, and we broke through that wall on a Monday morning in June. The passage behind that wall was not like the tunnels I'd seen on those tourist tours. Those tunnels were crude, functional, clearly dug out to move cargo, or maybe a few kidnapped sailors from the saloons down to the piers. This was different. The brickwork was smooth, expertly laid. There were alcoves set at perfect intervals. Each alcove held a small niche as if it was meant to display something. Though they were all empty now, this new tunnel had stretched in two directions from my basement, following a route that wasn't on any historical map, and etched into the brick every few feet were dates. They started with 1888 and continued all the way to what looked like 1953. And under every date was a number. 1888 had the number 9, 1891 had 15, 1902 had 21. The numbers changed, but they were never small. Always more than 5, never more than 25. I followed the tunnel north first, just mapping it with my phone, thrilled about this huge discovery. After maybe 200 feet, I found a junction. It connected to the known tunnel system, the ones from the history books. But this connection? It had been sealed from the other side, bricked up so that anyone exploring the main tunnels would never, ever find this passage. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to hide this place to wipe it from the map. I turned around and explored the southern path. This one went deeper, sloping down at a steady angle. And after about 300 feet, I found the chamber. It was a large, circular room, maybe 40 feet across, with a high, vaulted ceiling. It was clearly built for gatherings. I saw iron brackets in the walls where torches or lamps once hung. The floor was worn down in a circular pattern from endless foot traffic around the edge. But the center of the room was dominated by the well. It was perfectly round, about 6 feet across, built from the same strange brick, and it plunged far deeper than any well should in a town this close to the sea. I aimed my flashlight down, and I couldn't see a bottom. Just a blackness that ate the light. And a smell. A smell rose up from it. Not sewage, not rot, but something cold and chemical. Like static and burnt iron. Etched into the brick floor all around the well were names. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them carved in different scripts, different styles stretching back through the decades. I recognized some of those surnames. They were the old families, the names you see on our street signs, on the historical markers. names like my own that were part of the town's very founding. And beside many of the names were dates matching the ones from the tunnel. And next to those dates were simple notations. Words like offered, taken, sealed. I photographed everything. My excitement was now turning into a cold, creeping dread. This was no crimping tunnel. This was something else. Something hidden on purpose and based on my family's name being carved in that floor, something we had been a part of. I spent the next 2 weeks in the archives cross, referencing the names from the chamber with old newspapers' vital records. What I found made my blood run cold. The dates carved into the walls. They corresponded perfectly with missing persons cases, unsolved disappearances going all the way back to the town's founding. The numbers next to each date, they matched the exact number of people who had vanished that year, and nearly all of them disappeared between November and January. Our storm season. When Port Fathom is cut off from the world by wind and high seas, the official stories were all different. A ship lost in a squall, a mill worker who just moved on, a drifter passing through. But the pattern, once I knew to look for it, was undeniable. Every single year, like clockwork, people vanished. And every single year, those disappearances were explained away and forgotten. I found a partial diary in the County Historical Society donated anonymously back in '67. It was written by a man named Silas Croft, who called himself a founding member of the Port Fathom Merchants Guild. That was the original business group formed to promote trade. Croft's journal from 1890 described meetings held in what he called the lower chamber. And they discussed something he only ever referred to as the arrangement. According to Croft, the arrangement was struck in 1888, right after a terrible winter that nearly wiped the new settlement off the map. Storms had shattered the fishing fleet, floods ruined the warehouses, and sickness had killed dozens. The town was about to fail. The founders were desperate. Croft wrote that they found something while digging the foundations for the new harbor district, something that was there before the settlement, maybe before any humans had been there. He described it as a presence that does not abide by our rules of nature or time. And he said this presence offered the desperate founders a bargain. The exact terms were never written down, but Croft's careful language made it clear enough. In exchange for prosperity, for protection from the storms that leveled other coastal towns, for a success that would make Port Fathom thrive while others failed, the founding families agreed to provide regular offerings. Not goods, not money, people. Transients. Drifters, sailors with no families. Anyone who wouldn't be missed. Anyone whose vanishing could be easily excused. These offerings were taken to the lower chamber and given to the well. Sent down to whatever or whoever was at the bottom. And in return, Port Fathom flourished. The fishing industry boomed. The canneries multiplied. The town survived gales that destroyed neighboring communities. And every year, the arrangement was honored by the Merchants Guild, which over time became what we now call the Main Street Business Alliance, an alliance of which my own father was the current president. I confronted my father on a Sunday night. I showed him the pictures, the research. I demanded to know if he knew. He turned ghostly white when he saw the images of the chamber. He just sat down heavily, looking much older than his 68 years. And then he told me the truth. All of it. The secret, passed down through the founding families for over a century. The arrangement was real, and it was still active. The well wasn't just a well. It was a doorway, a threshold to something else. Something that had existed under this land long before humans ever came. Something that fed on human awareness, human vitality. The offerings kept it satisfied, and in return it bent probability in Port Fathom's favor. Natural disasters would just veer away at the last second. Economic crashes never hit us as hard. The town survived in ways that defied all logic. My father said that the process had become more refined over the years, more careful. The Alliance had evolved methods to select offerings that truly would not be missed. People in the final stages of a terminal illness who were sedated and brought to the chamber believing they were being moved to a hospice. Drifters battling severe addiction offered one last high that they simply never woke up from. Elderly homeless people given a warm meal and a bed before being quietly taken below. He insisted it was a mercy that they were choosing people whose lives were for all intents and purposes already over, and that their sacrifice saved hundreds, maybe thousands of other lives by keeping Port Fathom safe and prosperous. He showed me the data, the proof, Port Fathom's survival rate during massive storms, its economic strength, its impossibly low rates of crime and disaster. All of it defied the odds. The arrangement works, he said, and breaking it would doom the entire town. I told him it had to stop, that we couldn't just murder people to maintain some kind of supernatural protection deal, that whatever was in that well, it needed to be destroyed or sealed off for good. He just looked at me and asked if I was willing to be responsible for the deaths that would follow, for the hurricane that would finally hit us, for the economic collapse, for all the suffering that would come once the protection was gone. He said every generation of our family has fought with this, that every one of them considered going public or trying to end it, and every single one ultimately decided that the alternative was worse. He said, "You will come to the same conclusion I did. The moral burden of a few unavoidable deaths is lighter than the burden of letting thousands suffer from a disaster you could have prevented." I didn't agree. I couldn't agree. I left his house determined to expose it all. I went to the local paper, tried to get a reporter interested, but I had no physical evidence. My father had the tunnel entrance sealed with fresh concrete within days of our talk. All I had were photographs that could have been taken anywhere. I went to the police. The chief, he listened patiently. And then he explained that he was aware of certain historical agreements that benefited the community, and that sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. He suggested I think very, very carefully about what I was trying to do, and whether disrupting community stabilities was really in anyone's best interest. That's when I realized how deep it went, how many of Port Fathom's leading families were in on it, complicit. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. I can't stop thinking about those names carved around that well, about the people taken into the dark who never came back, sacrificed to buy prosperity for a town built on hidden murder. And I'm terrified because I've started to have dreams about the chamber, dreams of standing at the edge of that well and hearing something calling up from the blackness, not in words, but like a frequency that bypasses your ears and speaks right to the oldest part of your brain. In the dreams, I understand it. The thing in the well, it isn't evil. Not in any way we would understand. It's just old, alien. It operates on a logic that has nothing to do with us. It was here before we were. It will be here long after we are gone. And the arrangement, it's just the terms of our coexistence, the rent we pay for living in its space. Last week I got a letter. It was from the Main Street Business Alliance, inviting me to join as my family's representative now that my father is stepping down. The letter was formal, polite. And inside the envelope was a key to a private entrance to the tunnel system. They're pulling me in, making me part of it, ensuring my silence by making me participate. And the most terrible part is that I'm actually considering it, not because I think it's right, but because I've looked at the alternative. I've researched what happened to other coastal towns, The ones without this protection, towns like Ocean Bend or Cape Sorrow, dozens of little settlements that were either devastated or just abandoned. And I've looked at Port Fathom's history, at our consistent prosperity, the miraculous near misses, the way this town has weathered everything for over 130 years. The arrangement has claimed somewhere between 800 and 1,000 lives since 1888. It's about 7 people a year, taken from the edges of society, people who were already abandoned. And in exchange, Port Fathom has thrived. It supports a population of 10,000 people across generations. It's created lives and families and futures that would never have existed if this town had failed like all the others. The utilitarian math. It's impossible to ignore even if it makes me sick. 7 lives to save thousands, year after year. If I had to make that choice from the beginning, I want to say, I'd say no. But I'm not. I'm not sure that I can. The initiation meeting is next month, November 15th, on the new moon. I've been told that all new members must witness an offering. They must understand exactly what they are joining. They must make their choice with full and complete knowledge of what the arrangement demands. And I just don't know what I'm going to do. Part of me wants to just run. Leave Port Fathom and never look back. Try to forget everything I've learned. But this is my home. This is my town. And walking away, it means abandoning all of them to whatever happens if the arrangement is broken. So I will probably go to that meeting. I will probably witness what happens at the well. And I will probably take my place among the families who have kept this terrible secret for generations. The families who have all made the same impossible choice. The choice between individual morality and collective survival. Because sometimes the real truth of a place isn't in its history books or its tourist traps. Sometimes it's buried in a hidden tunnel beneath the streets. It's carved in names around a dark well that sinks into a blackness older than our entire civilization. And sometimes the price for paradise is paid in a currency that never makes it into the official records. Paid by people who are erased from history, sacrificed to keep the rest of us safe from a truth we just can't afford to face.